One of the interesting things we can do is what if we picked up Korea, if we picked it up and we put it in Europe? How big would it be? Because in general, we tend to think of European countries as big and a lot of these Asian countries as small.
스탠퍼드와 예일 대학교, 서던 캘리포니아 대학 등 미국 내 명문대에서 30년 가까이 강의를 하며 미국 내 한국학 연구를 선도하고 있는 학자가 있습니다. 미국 이름 데이비드 찬웅 강, 한국 이름 강찬웅 교수입니다. 그가 서던 캘리포니아 대학의 한국학 연구소를 설립한 것은 1995년. 설립 당시 단 한 명에 불과했던 한국학 박사 과정 학생은 현재 매년 30명이 넘으며 500명 안팎의 학생이 한국학을 부전공으로 선택할 정도로 인기라고 하는데요. 오늘은 데이비드 강 교수님의 강연을 준비했습니다. 한국에 대해 잘 모르는 외국인들을 대상으로 그는 과연 어떤 이야기를 풀어놓았을까요?
Every country is important, every region is interesting. So in some ways, the question is, why would you take some time out for Korea? But I want you guys to take away some of the things that I find most interesting about why Korea is something worth studying, right? So we'll start, why should anybody care in the first place, right? Just in case you don't know where Korea is, you are here. Right? It's really small if you think about it, right? It's not in the center of anything. It's not in the center of Europe or in the center of Asia. It's way off on the side, way up north. But it is worth trying to figure out why it has been so geopolitically important. As I'm sure Mary told you earlier, Korea is interesting geographically because there's a lot of things we say the most, the biggest, et cetera, in the world. But this is actually true. It's the only place in the world where the interests of the four major superpowers literally touch each other. And what I mean by that is, if you go to India or Iran or Iraq, USA is 10,000 miles away, Russia's 10,000, Here, Korea shares land borders with Russia and China. Its closest relation to Japan is 50 miles by ferry. And of course, as many of you know, the United States had at one time 100,000 troops and nuclear weapons on the peninsula. And now we have 30,000 troops. So the four biggest economies, the four biggest countries in the world are literally nose to nose on the Korean peninsula. And I'm not sure if you guys have heard this before. So here's China, Russia shares this border, here's Japan, the US is there. And we're going to take a minute, and I don't know if you guys have done this yet, but you know how Italy looks like a boot? What does Korea look like? If you sort of squint, what does it look like? Raise your hand. Don't shout it out. In the back. Yeah, a rabbit. Wow, you guys are good. Did you hear this before? You already heard this. No, did you? Okay, where is it, right? Korea looks like a bunny, right? Here's the ears. Here's the little nose, here's some paws, and here's some paws, right? Now, the interesting thing is that this is sort of traditionally, when I was growing up, this is what we said. But what it's come to be known sort of in international relations is looking like a bunny, not that macho, right? Not manly enough. So Koreans will now tell you that it looks like a tiger. However, and this may not be politically correct, but I submit to you that is not what you would think of. You really have to squeeze the tiger to get it in there, right? I think it looks more like a bunny, frankly. But I will admit a tiger is more macho. So anyway, that's what Korea looks like. Now, how big is Korea? In general, as we know, we tend to think of China and Japan as huge, and Korea as really small. So one thing that we did, you can do, is you can take population and sort of landmass, the size in 1,000 square kilometers, and you put a bunch of Asian countries on there, and it looks sort of what you expect. Japan's big, 130 million people. Thailand, Philippines, South Korea, 45, 50 million people. Singapore is tiny, of course. It's a little city-state, about 4 million people. So yeah, right, there's some really big countries, there's some small countries. But in a way, that doesn't necessarily tell us that much about it. One of the interesting things we can do is what if we picked up Korea, if we picked it up and we put it in Europe? how big would it be? Because in general, we tend to think of European countries as big and a lot of these Asian countries as small. So we did the same thing, population and landmass. What's interesting about this chart? Just go ahead and look at it for a minute. I mean, the first thing I would say is Japan is huge, right? With 130 million people, Japan is almost twice the population of Italy, France, UK. Japan is a huge country if we put it in Europe. And a unified Korea would be roughly the same size as all the European countries, 75, 80 million people. And a land mass roughly the same. It's not like UK, Germany, and Italy are over here and Korea's down there. I mean, Korea is a big country if you put it in Europe. It's actually not that small, because we're used to thinking of Germany and France and whatever as being big, right? The problem for Korea, and frankly for Japan, is that this is a false map, because this is really what East Asia looks like. That's Japan down there. That's Thailand. Korea is the 48, right? South Korea. China is huge. China is a continent-sized country. So of course, compared to China, everybody's small. It's the same way as the United States, right? We are a continent-sized country. Right? So European countries would all be clustered around there, and the US is here. But it's just to give you a sense of the scale, right? For most countries that aren't continent-sized, Korea is actually pretty normal-sized. It's not that small. Now, why also do we care? This is a chart, and I don't have too many charts, but I think this is very interesting. One way we compare is economic development. We all know that Korea, how many of you have a Samsung or an LG phone, TV, etc., Hyundai car, right? Korea's had an economic miracle in many ways. It's one of the things when I teach my undergrads or my MBA class that we spend time on. How did they grow so fast? But this chart is particularly vivid, because it's not just are we richer than we were before, because every country is basically richer than they were before. No matter how poor they are, cell phones didn't exist, and now you've got people in the poorest of countries who can actually buy a cell phone, right? So they're better off than they were. But often we want to measure, are you catching up to the richest countries, or in this case, the United States? So what this does here is puts economic wealth, per person income, GDP per capita, gross domestic product per capita, or wealth per person, as a percentage of American wealth per person. Okay, so you guys got that, right? If you go back to 1950, the red is Mexico and the blue is Brazil. 15% as rich. So every Mexican was about 25% as rich as every American per person. You watch over a generation, by the 1980s, Mexico had risen to 35%. They were beginning to catch up. However, that was short-lived. And so by 2004, Mexico is basically per person as rich as it was 50 years ago. So yeah, Mexicans today are richer than they were yesterday. Brazilians were at 15%, now they're at 20%, right? But they're not really closing the gap in terms of wealth compared to the United States. The United States is getting richer just as they're getting richer. And sadly, this is the case for most countries around the world outside of Europe. Africa, Latin America, Middle East, many South Asian countries. So why are Korea, Taiwan, these kind of countries so interesting? They started out, green is Taiwan, yellow is Korea. They started out at 10% as rich, 1/10 as rich per person as America in 1950. But rather than a sort of up and down thing, it's almost a direct line upwards. So that by 2004, they're over 50% as rich as the United States. And they've continued to close the gap. These numbers just haven't been updated.
발상의 전환이 중요하다고는 하지만 이런 식으로 자료를 보고 나니 그 말을 더욱 실감하게 됩니다. 데이비드 강 교수님의 강의 재밌게 보셨나요? 다음 영상으로 더욱 흥미진진한 강연 내용을 전해드릴게요. 오늘도 함께 해주셔서 감사합니다.